Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, thank you for joining us today. My name is Rosetta Clay. I'm the Assistant Vice President of Engagement. And as I said, welcome to day 2 of Illinois Wesleyan University's Homecoming 2020. This is our week-long virtual celebration of your time as a Titan. I hope you are as excited as we are about the schedule of events and activities that we've planned for you. Our team has worked extremely hard in this non-traditional gathering to uphold traditions and getting creative to ensure that you all are able to enjoy this week. One of those traditions is the Back to College class. And over the past few months, these webinars have enabled us to learn, gain greater understanding, and engage in dialogue about topics we may have been reluctant to discuss, and also have greater questions to ask. Well, today's Back to College class is no different in that you will be enlightened about the plight of asylum seekers. A few reminders of how the webinar will be conducted. Everyone is muted. However, you are encouraged to participate by using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. I will make every effort to get to as many questions as possible. And in case you have to leave early, or if you would like to share this webinar with others, it is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel for future viewing. And now I'd like to ask Professor Adriana Ponce, who is the Associate Professor of Music and has been with IWU for 17 years, to introduce our speaker for today. Adriana?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm here to introduce Sara Ghadiri, our Robert M. Montgomery Outstanding Alumni Award winner of the year. You probably already know a bit about her. She graduated magna cum laude at IWU with a double major in comparative political science and philosophy and a minor in music. She earned a law degree from the University of Iowa College of Law with a number of honors and awards. Upon graduation, she joined Chapman and Cutler's Banking and Financial Services Department and Litigation Group and became the firm's first pro bono counsel. Nowadays, she balances her pro bono work with an active bank-related litigation practice. Her work and advocacy on behalf of pro se litigants, immigrants, and survivors of domestic violence has won her awards from Chapman and Cutler, the American Bar Association, the National Immigrant Justice Center, Legal Aid Chicago, and the Illinois JCs. Now onto some things you might not know. During her time at our School of Music, Sara was a double bass player. She was part of the orchestra and the jazz ensembles and played electric bass with the Titan Band. And if I can manage here, I will show you a picture. You see her there, the one with the pink hat. She took several music history courses with me, some of them just for the fun of it. She belonged to a number of student organizations and other societies and left a mark on peers, faculty, and staff. Ed Reisinger remembers her as a good player that knew how to have fun, one who even danced a bit in some of the Titan Band charts. Laura Dolan remembers her unfailing smile and positive outlook. Judith Hanna, her passion for social justice and global events, which managed to sneak in even into their double bass lessons. I remember her as a beautiful, inquisitive person who was as smart and hardworking as she was non-assuming and open-minded, a person eager to learn and true to her many talents and interests. In my mind, she represented the kind of student that we strive to attract and cultivate, the kind of student that we all want to have in our class. And I'm ready to bet that she's also the kind of attorney, advocate, and human being that anyone in a vulnerable position would want to have by and on her side. So when I was asked to introduce Sara, I jumped at the opportunity to join in celebrating her accomplishments, attend her lecture, and learn from her. And here I am, thrilled to introduce our Robert M. Montgomery Outstanding Alumni Award winner, Sara Ghadiri, who will give a talk entitled Beyond the Border, the Law for Asylum Seekers. Welcome, Sara, on behalf of so many of us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ponce. I really appreciate the kind words. It really warms my heart, and I miss your classes deeply. So hopefully you'll enjoy my class as much as I enjoyed yours. All right. So quick overview. We'll go through just a tiny bit about me, although Dr. Ponce has already said a good bit. Talk a little bit about immigration law basics, discuss asylum in the process, run through some asylum statistics, and then talk about some recent changes in the law. So I graduated in December 2010, class of 2011, like Dr. Ponce said, with a double major in political science and philosophy and a minor in music. I graduated from the University of Iowa College of Law in 2014 and now serve as pro bono counsel at Chapman & Cutler, LLP. I have to make an important caveat. All of these opinions are my own. None of this is legal advice. And when we do get to the questions, I will not be answering any specific questions about anybody's specific situation, but I'll do my best to speak generally to the extent possible. I've had a great career at Chapman over the last 6 years, representing people before the Supreme Court, the Ninth Circuit, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, and the Executive Office of Immigration Review, and then also having the opportunity to draft legislation and testify before legislative committees. So with all that about me, I want to start with some definitions, because at Wesleyan in the philosophy department and in the political science department, one of the things that we always learn about is we have to know what we're talking about before we start getting started talking about it. So I'm just going to put these up really quickly. The immigration code in the United States is called the Immigration Nationality Act. It's been amended. It's probably more complicated than any statute you could set out to write. An alien is just any person not a citizen or national of the US, not talking about extraterrestrials here. Immigrants are defined, so we tend to use the word immigrant a lot to talk about a lot of different things, but under the immigration code, there's a really specific definition, and it means that you have to be legally admitted, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. Specific to my presentation and talking specifically about asylum, the definition of a refugee comes actually from international law, and it sets forth a test for who is a refugee. And if you are outside of the country you're trying to stay in, so for example, if you're outside of the United States applying for relief to be able to come in, then you're a refugee. However, if you apply for relief from inside the country you're in, then you're called an asylee. So all asylees are refugees, but not all refugees are asylees, kind of like squares versus rectangles. USCIS, like I mentioned, is United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. And then the Executive Office of Immigration Review is part of the executive branch. It is not part of the judicial branch, which is a little confusing to people who may know a little bit about the US court system. But that also houses the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is the first level of appellate review from immigration court. So let's talk a little bit about immigrants versus non-immigrants. So if you're not a US citizen, every person who lawfully enters the US has either immigrant status or non-immigrant status. So non-immigrant status are things you might be familiar with if you are an international student and you're here on an F1 visa, or if you have family from another country who's come to visit on a tourist visa. Those visas mean that you can come, but only for the specific purpose that the visa says you can come for. So if you're here for tourism, you can't work. If you're here to be a student, you can't work, right? If you're here on a work visa, then you can, right? So that has to do with whether you can then transition into another status that we'll talk about a little bit later. Immigrant status is for people who either live permanently in the United States or are coming to the United States to live permanently. So there's special visas for that. Some people come on diversity visas, which is literally a lottery. Some people get engaged to somebody abroad and then they bring that person as a fiance to see if they'll like the United States, and then they have to get married within a certain amount of time. You might have heard of immigrant status referred to as permanent resident, LPR, which is legal permanent resident, green card holder, or a resident alien. So what about people without status? These are the people that I often run into in my practice. This is often a little bit of a sticky sort of verbiage because a lot of people call these illegal immigrants. I don't like the word illegal immigrant. I don't think it's representative because we've talked about immigrant, and immigrant is somebody who's lawful. So you're saying it's illegal, lawful, that doesn't make any sense, right? I usually tend to use people without status. I don't like unlawfully present either, but that's technically true, and that's what DHS, Department of Homeland Security, uses. And this means that people could have come in EWI, which is entered without inspection, or you could have come on a visa and then violated the terms of that. So let's say you came on a tourist visa and started working, now then you don't have status anymore because you've lost your status because you violated the terms. A special note about DACA. A lot of you guys, I'm sure, know what DACA is, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It is a status, but it's not a non-immigrant status. So even though it is lawful for people who have DACA to be in the United States, because most of them didn't enter lawfully, it's not a immigrant status. So how do you get to be a lawful permanent resident, right? So green card is what you see the picture of there, that permanent resident card. A long time ago, they looked a lot different. My dad, when he came to the United States, had a green card with no expiration date. As you guys may have guessed, they don't do that anymore. They all have expiration dates now and require more frequent renewals. But there are a lot of different pathways for this, some of which you might be familiar with. The most common one is family. Let's say you're an American citizen, you marry somebody who's not, you can get a green card that way. That's how my dad got a green card here. You can also get an employer to sponsor you. There are also special statuses for children who are abandoned or neglected called Special Immigrant Juvenile Status, SIJS. You can get a green card as a refugee or as an asylee. There are pathways to get green cards for victims of human trafficking or crimes. Those are called T visas or U visas. And then victims of abuse. And then also there are other categories like the diversity lottery I mentioned. Sometimes there are special programs. So you might have heard the administration is ending some special programs that were for people from certain countries and that kind of stuff. So now that we know what an immigrant is, what the differences between an immigrant and a non-immigrant is, and a little bit about how green cards work, what is asylum? It's a special protection to against what's called refoulement, which is a French word, but it basically means that we're not going to send you back somewhere if you're going to be persecuted or killed again. And this actually arose out of World War II. As you guys know, because you study your history, World War II was at one point the worst refugee crisis in history. And people were persecuted by Nazis, they were persecuted by all sorts of other sorts of people. And in that aftermath, as the world was sort of trying to rebuild and put the pieces together, one of the first things that the UN did was make this convention on the status of refugees. And initially, the United States wasn't a signatory. They didn't actually become a signatory until like the 70s. But the idea being that we realized as an international community that there were some people who just couldn't go back to where they were before, because they would either be hurt or die or something horrible would happen to them. So when we talk about asylum law, I don't want to get into it too much because you guys aren't lawyers, and if I was giving a presentation to lawyers, it would look a little bit differently. But I want you to understand what exactly you need to prove in order to get asylum. You can't just show up and say, like, I'm going to be hurt if I go back. So there's a test. It sort of looks like a legal proof in some ways, but you can get asylum by showing you have a well-founded fear of persecution perpetrated by the government or someone the government is unable or unwilling to control on account of, for that reason, of your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or particular social group. So to regular, non-lawyers, these words are not as familiar probably, because these are all what we call terms of art. So persecution isn't just, somebody called me a name or something like that. Each of these elements has developed case law, and in some circumstances, parts of the Code of Federal Regulations address what all of these things are. So a particular social group could be, let's say, you're a member of the LGBT community in Kazakhstan, where they regularly beat up, gay men, for example, right? That's not really race, religion, nationality, or political opinion, but because it's a group of people that have an immutable characteristic, that would qualify as a particular social group. So you can draw particular social groups in a lot of different ways. It's a way to sort of try to be a little bit creative in trying to craft the best case for your client. And so, there is some creativity in here within these rules. And that's kind of how I think of being a lawyer in a lot of ways is, okay, figure out what the test is and then figure out where the squishy bits are so that you can try to make the best case for your client. So it's very complicated, and there are a number of different ways a refugee can get into the United States and get that green card that I was mentioning before. And all of these will use that same test that we just talked about. But you can see that there are sort of four main sort of pathways that, that you could get into the United States. So the first one is as a refugee. So I'm not going to talk about that very much, even though the test is the same for a refugee and an asylee. That process is very different. But starting with B, you can see this is the affirmative asylum process. So in an affirmative asylum case, you have somebody who's coming to the United States on a valid visa. Maybe they were going to attend a conference. Maybe they were coming as a student. Maybe they came as a tourist, whatever it happens to be. They enter in the United States validly, right? So they go, they get a stamp in their passport and all that great stuff. From there, you can say, okay, now that I'm in the US, I want to apply for asylum. Nobody said I have to leave. Nobody said anything about me. I'm here like I'm supposed to be doing the thing that I'm supposed to be doing. So that you can apply for asylum through USCIS, and then an asylum officer will evaluate your application, do an interview with you. You'll have to have fingerprints taken and that sort of stuff, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then you can get asylum, okay? The second process is for people who are fleeing persecution, who cross the border without a visa. And so in that case, sometimes those people get caught. For individuals who are flight risks or other risk that the government determines, they'll put you in jail. And when I say jail, I mean actually county jail. Most immigration detainees, at least in the Chicago area, are held at county jail. And so there are special officers, and there's a special immigrant detention, but it is literally in the county jail. And if you want to claim asylum, then you have to actually meet with an asylum officer and do what's called a credible fear interview. And that's where they're deciding, okay, well, do we think that you're actually telling the truth? Do you think that your story rises to the level to meet that test that I talked about? And so then, so the government could say, okay, well, yeah, I believe you, but you're a flight risk, so I'm gonna just keep you in jail. And that could be up to, probably 4 or 5 months, generally speaking, before you get a hearing. Now, it's possible to get out of immigration detention. You can get what's called parole, but that's really limited right now, and almost nobody's getting it. It was designed for humanitarian reasons, but one of the things that the administration has been doing is cutting back on that. So if your credible fear interview is denied, then you get deported, okay? And if you, once you have that opportunity to have a hearing, and that's before the judge, you can either win or you lose. And again, if you lose, you get deported. The last kind is the defensive asylum process, where you actually get picked up. So let's say, for example, you cross the border or you entered without inspection, and then immigration catches you. So ICE or CBP or somebody gets you, then they issue what's called a notice to appear, an NTA. And an NTA is sort of like a charging document, which is sort of like if you get charged with a crime in criminal court, they'll say, okay, you violated X statute, and this is what you did. An NTA is very similar to that. And so then you can get caught, and then you can either again be put into detention, or in some cases you can be put on parole. Most people who get parole out of immigration detention then have to wear like an ankle monitor. You guys might have heard of that. That was a lot more common than it is now. But that's part of a program called Alternatives to Detention. And so it was one of the ways that the government was releasing people, especially if you had entered with a child. That was sort of a common thing that was happening before. Regardless of which way you apply for asylum, it ends up being, that you can either win or you can lose, but there are obviously steps to that, which we'll talk about. So we'll talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts, because I want you to know exactly how much information people have to present in order to get asylum. Again, like I said, it's not just you show up and you tell your story. There's a lot more than that. So number one, regardless of which of those lanes you're in, which of those 3 lanes we talked about that you're in, you have to file what's called an I-589. And an I-589 is a couple of pages. It's mostly biographical information, and then towards the end, you kind of explain what happened to you. But in all of the cases, all your filing is what's called a skeleton, which is basically you give a brief description about what you've done, because you need to file quickly. If you don't file within 1 year, it's very difficult to get asylum. So for the most part, everybody's clock is kind of ticking once you enter the United States. So you need to file within a year. And sometimes, given the fact that there are lots of backlogs and all that stuff, the asylum office isn't going to look at your whole case right away anyway. So they'll let you file just a little bit. Once you file, as long as you're not in detention, you would be eligible after 365 days to petition for work authorization. This used to be 180 days. But because of a new rule change, it's now you must wait a year after you apply for asylum before you can work. And you can probably guess sort of what the rationales for that might be, including like deterrence and getting people to not apply. So here's what actually gets filed. And it's a little different between the asylum office and immigration court. But I want you to see, right before the merits hearing or before the asylum office interview, you are preparing a brief, which is usually like somewhere between 15 to 20 pages, same with the legal memo, going through all of the legal arguments for why you should win and why each of those elements of that test we talked about have been met. You have to have a declaration from your client, which is a written statement telling their whole story of everything that happened to them. You prepare what's called an annotated index, which is all of the evidence that you're able to collect, which sometimes isn't a lot, right? Sometimes when people are running away from persecution, they don't think to like bring pictures of stuff. And so what we're using are like, we'll use the immigrant's body as evidence, right? If you got beat and they broke your arm, we can have a doctor review you and say, okay, yeah, I reviewed this person. I like felt their arm, or we did an x-ray. I see the way that the remodeling looks. It's consistent with a hit coming from, the top or something like that. And so we can actually use the immigrant's own body as part of their evidence and submit a declaration from a doctor that says, oh yeah, this is consistent, that these injuries probably did occur the way that they said that the immigrant said that they did. So we also use country conditions evidence. So some of you guys who study political science or international relations or anything might know about specific NGOs that focus on human rights and human rights abuses. So sometimes they'll put out reports. So groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Freedom House, those types of organizations are sort of viewed as non-biased or somewhat less biased providers of information about what's actually happening on the ground. Because one of the things we need to prove to the judge is, well, is what they're saying consistent with what's actually happening in that country, right? So if they say, I was in a protest that happened on X day, right? And there was a huge crackdown on that. And let's say, we were protesting an unfair election. And it was covered by one of these organizations or by the news, right? Let's say like Reuters or New York Times, or somebody wrote an article about it. You can say on this day this happened. Well, that's consistent because we can prove from the news record that actually did happen. And so the index lists all of the supporting documentation that I was just talking about. Stuff that's from very basic, like if they have a passport, through expert reports, like I mentioned, the doctor, or even a country conditions expert, or maybe a mental health evaluation. Many of my clients have PTSD from the horrible things that they suffered in their country, and so sometimes that can be helpful too. But like I said, the main point of all of this is that there is a huge volume of information. I've never submitted an asylum application, like a full one, prior to a hearing or an interview that's less than several hundred pages. And so it's definitely an uphill battle for people who are filing. So I mentioned the affirmative asylum process. I want to just break that down a little bit so you can kind of see, not only is it a lot of documents, but it's a long process and it's a multi-step process. So if you're applying affirmatively, right, that's that first track that we talked about, track B, you will apply to USCIS. You'll get a receipt in the mail, and that takes about a month-ish, depends. Now that it's coronavirus, like everything is all messed up, but you would get a receipt, and then you get another letter, which is a request for biometrics. Every person who's applying for asylum has to get fingerprinted. so that the government has those records. Then we'll get a notice saying, hey, your asylum interview is going to be on X date and you have to submit your supporting materials. And then a couple weeks after that, you'll have the interview, but they don't tell you right then if you won or not. They make you wait a little bit, and then they'll say, okay, you can come and pick up your decision. You would go to the asylum office in person, pick up your decision, and then open the envelope and see what it says. So, for example, I had a client, a gentleman from Kazakhstan, who had come here on an F1 visa as a student. He wanted to apply for asylum, so we filed his asylum application well in advance of that 1-year bar date. Then we got his receipt, and he went and had his fingerprints taken. Then we worked with him for a couple of weeks to put together his declaration. We had letters from his friends that were corroborating, because he had been beat so bad that he ended up in the hospital. He had hospital records that he had brought with, and like I said, letters from friends. And then we went to the asylum office for the interview. And he had the opportunity to tell his story, but what happened to him was so difficult that he had a panic attack in the middle of the interview. And so I sat with him and held his hand until he got to a point where he could breathe and finish the interview. But that's something that we might not think about when we're going through the asylum process, is that not only do you have to tell your story to your attorneys for them to write it down, but in the interview, you also get, you have to answer the questions and tell what happened to you. And for a lot of people, that's very, very difficult. Fortunately for him, we were able to win his case. And now we're actually working on his adjustment, which I'll actually explain a little bit later. But starting the process for him to be able to go to get a green card. So the immigration court process is slightly different, but a little bit similar. Someone will be picked up at the border. So I had a client, a woman from Egypt, who came on a tourist visa and was coming in, and I picked her up because they thought she had been working on her on her tourist visa. And so they revoked her visa. And so she didn't have any reason to be able to stay in the United States. So she claimed asylum and went through that credible fear process that we talked about. She got a notice to appear, which is that charging document. And then because she passed her credible fear interview, I got her case before what's called the master calendar hearing. And the master calendar hearing is an opportunity to set a date with the court for the merits hearing. So it's like 10 minutes tops, but most of the time it's maybe 2. And there are a lot of people who are not represented at this stage. Fortunately, my client was able to get help from National Immigrant Justice Center, who I volunteer with, but she was detained. And so at the master calendar hearing, I had to decide how long it would take me to do her case, with balancing the fact that she had to stay in jail that whole time. And so I could say, well, yeah, it would be nice to have another week, but that's another week she had to stay in jail. And so that's a little bit of a difficulty as you're scheduling and stuff like that. These are real people with real lives who are literally stuck, rotting in jail for having done nothing wrong other than asking for help. So then we had the opportunity to work with her to get a declaration. We had her evaluated by a doctor, which during COVID was very difficult. We had to kind of use some unique procedures and get special permission and stuff to be able to do that. But we were able to do it. And we had her merits hearing, which actually, because it was during coronavirus, had to be entirely on the phone. I couldn't see my client. I couldn't see the judge. I couldn't see counsel for ICE. I was doing the entire thing blind, which made it a lot more difficult. But fortunately, again, we were able to prevail. She had a horrible story. She was severely abused and raped by her husband, and also was a survivor of FGM. And so the judge was very sympathetic, and we were fortunately able to get a good decision, and she was released. So what happens when you win? So you can see, first of all, you could get relief. That's what happened in my last case that I was just talking about, my client from Egypt. She was granted asylum. There were other kinds of relief as well that we always ask for, called protection under the Convention Against Torture or withholding of removal. I'm not talking about those today because those could have their own separate presentation. But that's what it means in that box that says relief. So if Department of Homeland Security decides that they don't want to appeal, then the case is over. If the if you win, then you have to go to USCIS and get a paper called an I-94. That I-94 allows you to work. It also means that you're eligible for some benefits. Actually, as soon as you win, you're eligible for some benefits, but they're very, very limited and only to people who truly need them. And so you can get things like food stamps. Then you're eligible to apply for a green card after being in the US for 1 year. And right away, you can petition for a married partner or children who are under 21 and not married. So this client had 3 children, but one of them was over 21. So I could only petition for the 2 younger ones, and there's nothing I could do for the one that was over 21. And so that's also, very difficult to deal with. The other thing that could happen is that proceedings get terminated. So sometimes somebody in an asylum proceeding might be eligible for a green card. Let's say they didn't have status, but they got picked up, and in the meantime, they met somebody, fell in love, and got married. The asylum proceeding could get terminated because now that person has a green card, and so there's no reason anymore to do the asylum case. Of course, if you lose, you could be facing removal or deportation. In removal or deportation, again, you could appeal that order. You can go to the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is that first level. Or if you lose there, you can also appeal to federal court. And when you appeal to federal court, you're actually appealing to the federal circuit court, not the federal district court. So there's 3 levels, as you guys might remember from AP government or your civics class or whatever. You have federal district court, federal circuit court, and then the Supreme Court. And so you would go, in Chicago, you would go to the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals. So if you lose there and you lose again, then you could be deported. The other option is voluntary departure. So I have a client, a transgender woman from the Philippines, who had an asylum hearing and then decided not to go forward with it and elected to voluntarily depart. If you do that and you follow the rules, it doesn't necessarily strike against you the same way as a failure to depart would. And so you could get out and then potentially not have a bar against you if you ever wanted to try to come to the United States again. But if you take voluntary departure and you fail to depart, then you can get in much bigger trouble. And so what happened with my client was she was supposed to leave in March, and the Philippines closed their airspace and wasn't letting anybody land. And she tried to leave and couldn't, and tried to leave and couldn't 4 times. And then she said, actually, I think things have changed in the Philippines. I want to try to reopen my asylum case. And so I attempted to reopen her case, but we lost. So we have another 2 weeks or so to appeal to the BIA and decide whether or not we want to try to have that motion to reopen her case, decided by the BIA to see if maybe she could stay, right? But otherwise, there's not there aren't just that many options. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about grant rates and statistics because I think this is another piece that people maybe don't understand. So if you can, just use the chat box and tell me what you think the most common country is. That top blue bar there. Tell me what you think. I'll give everybody a second. Let me see. We got Poland, Colombia, Mexico. Any other guesses? You're all wrong. Yeah, Mexico is wrong. It's China. And so people don't think about this. They're like, wait, what? But like all of the immigrants are coming from Central America. And that's not necessarily wrong. But actually the majority, the highest number of granted asylees come from China. Anybody wants to guess? Oh, India. Okay, that's actually coming up here. El Salvador is second. So again, close. We are looking at people who are coming from Central America. And if you think about the population in El Salvador versus the population in China, this is a much more significant number of people leaving El Salvador, but they're not winning asylum at the same rate as Chinese people are. And the last one is India. So whoever guessed India, Kira West, you win for today. You are actually the only person to guess one that's in the top 3 that I saw come in the chat box. So good for you, killing it. The other countries are maybe ones that you might recognize, but those of you who said that the majority come from Mexico are actually quite a bit further down than you would think. There are also some that you might not have imagined at all, like Cameroon. I've represented 2 people from Cameroon, and because there's a civil war and an Anglophone separatist movement going on there, a lot of people are trying to flee, despite the fact that it's an ocean away, and you'll most certainly have to fly to somewhere in South America, and then sort of walk or take buses and make your way all the way up to the border. So despite the fact that it's difficult, they are also getting a lot of asylum cases granted. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about what's been going on in the last couple of years. You can see I put some black bars up here, just like I did with the other picture, to kind of talk about the numbers, right? And you can probably guess. Okay, so apparently Kira West has to make a full disclosure. She's a lawyer and practices in federal court in DC and has lots of non-citizen clients. So anybody who feels bad about it, you shouldn't feel bad about it, because Kira has an advantage, I guess. So going back to this slide here, as you might guess, the numbers are going up, but I'm not sure you know by how much. So if we just look at 2017, you can see an appreciable increase in the number of cases that are filed. You can also see an appreciable increase in the number of denials. That holds true in 2018, where the number of denials goes up by even more. And then, of course, in 2019, you have an inordinate number of cases that are being filed, the majority of which are being denied. And so this, a lot of people say, oh, well, that's just because a lot of people are coming in and, being fraudulent and not telling people the truth, or just they want to come here for economic reasons, or just because they want to be in America. It's not true. There are huge backlogs in immigration court and in the affirmative asylum process because there are a number of global refugee crises that are happening right now. There are refugees leaving from from loads of different countries in loads of different geographic areas, not just in what's called the Northern Triangle in Central America, but people fleeing Syria and people fleeing places in Africa, ethnic minorities that are being forced to leave, like the Uyghur people in China. There is a huge number of people who need help and need the sort of protections that asylum provides, but we haven't kept up with the demand. So I put up the slide before, but I want to just make a little bit of a finer point on it, that asylum applications are up 2.5 times from 5 years ago. And the number who have been granted asylum has also doubled. It's gone up by quite a bit, but the people who've been denied grew even faster. So you're talking about thousands and thousands of people who are being denied. So the ratio of grants to denials has changed significantly. That means 69% of asylum seekers were denied asylum or other relief in 2019, despite it being the world's largest global refugee crisis. And despite the fact that these people are filing, a lot of them are filing within that 1-year deadline, the majority of them are, they are waiting 3 or 4 years to have their cases decided. That means that they get to get here, start making a life in a number of cases for people who aren't detained, and then can just get ripped up and sent back. I also want to talk a little bit about representation in the immigration courts. So in a criminal case, right, the Constitution says that you get a lawyer, constitutional law and the Constitution say that you get to be represented in a criminal case, right? And so one of the things that's not true for immigrants in immigration court is that you get an attorney. You are not guaranteed an attorney in immigration court. There is no appointments like there are of like a public defender or anything like that. That doesn't exist in immigration court. So all the people that are representing people in immigration court are private attorneys like myself and Kira, who represent people, either for money or for free. And because the number of cases has skyrocketed and the number of attorneys has not similarly skyrocketed, you have a huge influx in the number of unrepresented people who are going before immigration court. And there is a strong, strong connection between having an attorney and being able to win an asylum case. So as we have more people applying, but fewer attorneys and fewer cases in which people are represented, we're finding ourselves at a huge crisis. So I want to talk a little bit about what this looks like now. So I shared all those scary statistics about what 2019 looked like. It is not getting better. So because of the coronavirus, the president has said, okay, well, we don't want any asylum seekers to come in. So since March 20, anybody who's been trying to come in over the border, for example, have been immediately returned to their country. Also this year, asylum grant rates has dropped even more, so that only about a quarter of people are actually winning. And that's 40% lower than the average during the Obama and Bush administrations. Also, and this is not a new thing, but there are some immigration judges that actually deny 100% of the claims that they see. And as I'm sure you can guess, it's not that 100% of those people are fraudulent. It's that some judges are using their discretion inappropriately. So you can see that in Oakdale, a judge granted asylum to only 1 out of more than 200 cases between 2015 and 2019. So there's a problem with immigration judges in this country. Many people who are very good immigration practitioners are turning away from it. Many judges retired because the immigration laws are just changing much more quickly than people can keep track of. In this year alone, there have been huge rule changes that basically would upend the asylum process as we know it right now. And so we end up having a huge, huge backlog of people who have not had their case heard yet. So I see a question come in. Can you petition to have a different judge hear the case? So this is funny because in Illinois, we're used to having the ability to do what's called substitution of judge. And so in Illinois, in state court, you have one as of right. So if you don't like the judge that you get assigned to, you file an SOJ and you get a new one. It's super easy. In immigration court, it's very difficult and almost impossible to just petition to have a different judge hear the case. Judges are supposed to recuse themselves if they know somebody or, they have some sort of conflict of interest or that kind of thing. But it's not so easy as just being like, oh crap, I got a judge that doesn't grant to anybody, so I'm just going to ask for a different judge. It's really unfair and unfortunate. Okay, so in addition to the fact that that the government has sort of blocked the border, in addition, of course, to the fact that people aren't moving around as much because they don't want to get coronavirus and that kind of stuff, there have been a number of challenges that we've had to deal with as immigration practitioners in the last year or year and a bit. And they sort of just keeps coming. So I mentioned we're not doing parole anymore. I had been able to get parole for certain of my clients, especially ones who've got, stronger ties to the United States, somebody that can pay for them and sort of help them get to their hearings and stuff like that. It's not happening anymore. They're just not letting people out. I mentioned that there are fee increases. This is currently enjoined. Actually, some of my friends at Sidley Austin just won a case that caused a nationwide injunction on the fee increases, but it would have made asylum applications, which are currently free, cost $50. And while $50 might not seem a lot to you, if you've just, flown from Cameroon to Ecuador and then taken buses and walked through the jungle and had to pay for all this sort of stuff to keep yourself alive and fed as you made that trek and journey, $50 is impossible. And these fee increases applied to lots of different immigration petitions. So petitions to adjust status and all that other stuff. Everything is becoming more expensive. Some of you guys might have heard of the Migrant Protection Program, which is the most hilarious definite name for this. It's more popularly known as the Remain in Mexico Protocol, where if you apply for asylum and you're Mexican, they'll make you wait in Mexico for that 3 or 4 years while your asylum case makes it through the pipeline. There are other things called expedited removal, where instead of getting fully advised of all of your rights and everything, the government can say, okay, well, we'll put you back and this won't count against you if you want to try to come lawfully. And people don't always understand it. There are also 2 new programs. PACR is one of them. There are 2 programs. One applies to people who are Mexican and one applies to non-Mexicans. But anyway, the idea being that we're just going to push you back. We're going to push you back and not give you the opportunity to even try. Wait times are insane right now. Even with USCIS, previously when you filed an affirmative case in front of USCIS, I would get a biometrics request maybe 2 or 3 months after I file it. I filed a case in April and I just got one now. So everything has been held up. And so immigration court was basically stopped for a long time, except for detained court. USCIS has halted all of its interviews. And some of that is totally reasonable, right? As we try to figure out how to live with, COVID-19. But some of it is more, makes it more difficult for people, even aside from that. And then of course the rules changing eligibility. There is a proposed rule. I actually represented an organization out of New York to draft an objection to the regulations, but essentially they would tighten that test that we talked about and rule out a bunch of people who would ordinarily be eligible to apply for asylum. And so it just basically would strip out a bunch of people who have suffered from horrible things just because of the category that they would fall in. So for example, there's been a long history in the administration of trying to stop people who are being persecuted by gang violence, or women who are victims of domestic violence, for example, from being able to apply for asylum. And so that's why that's one of the things that's sort of trying to get moved from an attorney general opinion saying don't do this to actual law saying don't do this. So what can I do? For those of you who listened to my speech, we talked a lot about doers, my acceptance speech. Volunteer. There's loads of opportunities. You can, if you speak a foreign language, so much the better. If not, organizations are always looking for mentors or people to help. You might think going to the grocery store is easy, but if you don't speak English and you've never been to a giant grocery store, it can be very, very daunting. And so just being a volunteer to help with that kind of thing is very, very helpful. Get educated. Coming to this presentation is a really good start. Learn more. Public comments can be submitted by anybody. It doesn't have to be, an organization. You don't have to be an expert on asylum law. You can just say, I don't think this is fair. I don't think this is right. Be engaged with your government. The more that you speak up, the better. And be an advocate. If you see somebody saying something xenophobic, call them out on it. Make your community a place where immigrants feel comfortable and safe. Or you can go to law school. I don't tell everybody to go to law school because it's not for everybody. But think about it. If it's something that you're interested in, you're certainly welcome to send me an email, talk to me. I love talking to people about why I went to law school or what I do. But there are other things to study besides besides being a lawyer that can make a huge change, like public policy or international relations or anything like that. So with that, I want to open it for questions. I know we're sort of running out of time, and I want everybody to have an opportunity to ask whatever questions they might have, again, with the caveat that I am not answering any questions about anybody's personal immigration situation. I did such a good job that nobody has any questions. Rosette, I think you might be muted.
I was just going to say, I think you were responding to questions as they were asking during the presentation as well. So
yeah.
So I do have one question. It's one I like to ask every presenter, and it is, you know, what keeps you passionate about this work and what keeps you energized, and how do you then self-care after, you know, sometimes I can imagine that this can be a bit tolling for you. So
Yeah,
the question last night, I'm going to ask it of you.
that's a great question. This work is heavy work. I'm not going to lie. I have heard about some of the worst things that humans can do to other humans, and it is depressing, and it is hurtful, and it is hard to deal with. But if you don't do it, who is going to? If you can't, you know, understand that if without having this opportunity to help, you know, who's gonna step up? You saw the statistics on representation, and I think I have the training, and I'm uniquely, you know, suited to be able to do this kind of work, because it needs to be done, and because the people that you're helping are people. I have been lucky enough to have some wonderful, wonderful clients who are just the nicest, sweetest, kindest people, despite everything horrible that's happened to them. And really it's the people that keep me going. Every time I have a new case, even with this one that I mentioned that I just lost, my client was like, thank you so much. I was like, I lost your case. Why are you happy? And she's like, well, you took the time. Nobody else was willing to take the time to help. And so for me, it's really very much, you know, remembering that people are people and everybody needs help. And that's sort of what keeps me energized. But secondary trauma is a real thing. And so I think it's really important to keep a good eye on your own mental health. I think it's really important to get help when you need it. The legal profession is notoriously bad for asking for help. And there are a lot of mental health issues in this profession. So it's really important to stay on top of it. And you know, the benefit of me having to balance everything means that I am doing all sorts of different kinds of work at the same time. And so if you can't do this full time, that is okay. You do not have to. If you have time to give, and that's one case a year, that's great too. But be really cognizant of how it's making you feel, because you have to be able to take care of yourself first before you can take care of anybody else.
Right. And Dr. Ponce did ask, why did you choose your branch of law and not go into criminal law, for instance?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I did not want to do criminal law. It did not seem like a good fit for me. I didn't find it as interesting. And I knew that I wanted to practice in the civil realm because I was really worried that I would mess up somebody's life. Now I do this work is basically the same. I could certainly mess up somebody's life big time. But I wasn't ready to take up that mantle. Fortunately, my little sister is now a prosecutor in Cedar Rapids, and she is doing criminal law, despite the fact that I offered to have her come and work at the same firm I did. She was not interested in that at all. So a lot of it has to do with, you know, volunteering and the stuff that I did in law school sort of leading me to, you know, meet the people that I met and take the opportunities that came for me.
And then Cheryl Overton, class of 80, asked, even if there is a change in the administration in November, given the number of judges appointed by this administration, do you foresee changes coming quickly?
That's such a great question. I wish I had an oracle so that I could see what January 22nd of next year looks like. It's hard to say because as you know, even if the both the House and the Senate were to flip and pass some law, you could almost be certain that law would get challenged. And because of the number of conservative judges that have been appointed, that navigating that and being strategic about where you file cases and in what circuits and what you need to do in order for something to get to the Supreme Court is going to be a lot more challenging, I think, than it ever used to be. So change coming quickly. I feel like with the US government as it is right now, nothing ever comes quickly. So I can probably say a quick no to that, but it definitely is going to be very challenging.
Yeah, nothing changes quickly in government, no matter who's in office.
That's right.
Julie Cross asks, what's the most common type of persecution people flee from that you see? Is there anything you've seen that has surprised you?
So all sorts of different kinds of stuff. It really depends on country. A lot of the cases that I see coming out of, for example, the Northern Triangle are mostly gang related. The governments are not protecting the people. They're fleeing from gang extortion and violence and that kind of thing. I have seen a lot of LGBT cases from all sorts of places where I never really would have thought about. For example, like you might have a country that gay marriage is not illegal. I mean, it's not legal, but it's not illegal. And so you would think, oh, well, that can't be that bad. But of course it is. What has really shocked me is the levels of human depravity that I have seen. I've seen people do just some horrible stuff, pretending to be a gay person on an app to then lure a person in, beat and rape them and threaten, and like film the whole thing and threaten to put it on like WhatsApp or Telegram. Those are things that surprise me, not necessarily so much where people are coming from, but the things that other people are willing to do to other people.
Our last question comes from Elizabeth. Off the top of your head, are there any other countries that have, that have asylum laws similar to the USA? So if an American citizen moved elsewhere, how would she be treated?
That's a great question. So there are a number of countries, and I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it's 27 or 20 countries, signatories. Germany or of other countries that take refugees and stuff like that. I don't know if an American citizen going to, for example, the UK and claiming political asylum, unless, you know, maybe they were, you know, a protester and they got beat and some horrible other stuff, the government was going to do something. I mean, I haven't seen cases like that. I mean, I hope that I won't. I think continue to be a haven for people, where people need to flee from. But yes, there are other countries that have asylum programs that are somewhat similar to the United States.
Okay, I really am going to make this the last question.
Oh, but it's Evan. You have to give it, because Evan is my friend.
Exactly. Evan is all of our friend. And so Evan gets the last question. How can conservative or liberal affect your ability to discern, observe danger, harm, etc.? That judge who has only approved one asylum claim just ignores countless examples. Evidence of things worth fleeing?
Yeah, so you would think, right, that just being a human would mean that you could understand whether or not people are telling the truth about the things that happen to them. I think some judges just say, well, everybody's lying. You're inconsistent. That's the number one reason I see for cases getting kicked out or not winning asylum. Oh, well, you said it was this in your declaration or to the asylum officer, but now you're saying this. I had a case, an indigenous woman from Ecuador who had come to the United States once, done a credible fear interview, and then taken voluntary departure or was deported, and then came back, and I got her case after she came the second time, but I didn't know she'd been here once before. And so she gave a credible fear interview the second time, and like 2 days after I took the case and filed my appearance, the attorney from DHS emailed me a copy of her previous credible fear interview, and I could see right away that they were inconsistent. And so I think and so I had to tell that client, I said, look, you know, you could certainly try, but as soon as a judge sees you're inconsistent, like you're gonna lose. And so I had to watch her, you know, decide to take voluntary departure and say that I don't want to, you know, move forward my case. And so I think most of the time it's judges finding some other reason. I don't think it's that they think that the things aren't happening. I just think that they think that these things aren't happening to these people. And so, you know, I've never been to Oakdale. I don't know what that court is like, you know, where the judges are denying everything. They just might be bad people. You know, it's hard to say. But what I've seen in Chicago is the judges that are tough basically find some reason to say no, mostly because they allege that people are being inconsistent.
Right. Well, Sara, again, congratulations on being this year's recipient of the Robert M. Montgomery Outstanding Young Alumni Award. Well deserving. And we so appreciate you sharing your story with us today. And thanks to all of you for engaging in this discussion. This presentation, as I said, and all other videos from this week will be available on our YouTube channel. You just go to YouTube and search for Illinois Wesleyan University Alumni Association. And once you've found it, be sure to subscribe to get notices of new releases from this week and in the future. We continue the homecoming festivities this evening at 6 p.m. Central Time with the homecoming edition of the Titan Talks webinar series, Doing Well and Doing Good, Young Leaders, which will feature panelists who are young alumni doing great work in the nonprofit world. So take a reprieve and come back later for another compelling discussion and to hear from our future leaders. Everyone stay safe and well and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.